On the podcast today, we will be talking about one party, the Traditional Unionist Voice. One of the most visible unionist parties on the scene will be meeting on Saturday for their first annual conference since the general election. This will be Jim Allister's first leader's address as the Member of Parliament for North Antrim, and we are asking about the future of the party and their position on the political spectrum. We will also be speaking with the party's sole MLA, Timothy Gaston, later in the podcast. You can watch it all on YouTube. Search Stormont Sources, where we upload clips and full episodes for you to enjoy. Head to YouTube, subscribe to our channel there for videos and updates. You can also follow us on X, watch clips on TikTok and Instagram, and subscribe to our mailing list at stormontsources.com. You can also get in touch with us on WhatsApp. The number is 0333 404 6507. That number again is 0333 404 6507. Remember to use the word Stormont so that we know that it's for this podcast. Also leave us a voice note so that we can play it on next week's podcast. You can also drop us an email too. hello@stormontsources.com. Okay. First topic today, and our only topic for today, we're doing a deep dive on to the TUV. They will be meeting this Saturday for their annual conference in Cookstown. The party will be celebrating success this year. They ended the 54-year Paisley dynasty last July with their leader taking the North Antrim seat with a 450-vote majority. We're also looking to better understand where the party is at the minute and where it needs to go. Tim, as our resident unionist former SPAD on this podcast, I want to ask you a wee bit because you've been involved with the DUP, and that's where the TUV came from. It came from the DUP. So what do you make of where the TUV are? You know, Jim Allister walked away in 2007 over the decision to go into government with Sinn Féin. I mean, have they really repositioned themselves since that key moment?
Well, they haven't. I mean, they've pretty much stayed where Jim Allister positioned them in 2007 when he walked away. They've been I think it's fair to say, a thorn in the side of the DUP from the day and hour that they were formed. And Jim Allister, you know, in those early days, certainly was someone that the DUP feared as to where would he take this party, take this movement. Would it be a flash in the pan? Would it have longevity? I think in 2007, most people thought it wouldn't be something that would still be around in 2025. I think that's for sure. I think most people thought this would maybe be a flash in the pan. Jim Allister would be faced down in the way other unionists who'd gone out on their own had done in the past, and the movement would go. But that hasn't been the case. I mean, obviously Jim Allister walked away twice from the DUP and then came back to the DUP.
So just for people who don't know, Jim Allister in 2004 was elected. He succeeded Ian Paisley in the European Parliament in 2004 for the DUP. He ran for the DUP, but he was an active DUP politician before that. Walked away over seat selections and different directions. And he walked away for actually quite a number of years, actually.
He did. He went
left
off
in the 80s.
He had a very successful career at the bar. I mean, Jim Allister was this ferocious criminal defence. He was junior barrister when I started out my legal career and then became a QC, now obviously KC. And he had this reputation of his cross-examination was mythical at the bar, of how he could just, cut through witnesses and get to the point. And, he was someone who was held in very high regard. And back in 2003, Ian Paisley had announced that he wasn't going to stand for the European Parliament again. And at that time, it had been felt that Nigel Dodds was going to be the person who would replace him. But there was a curveball was thrown in when the European Parliament changed their rules that you couldn't be a member of the national parliament and be a member of the European Parliament. You could only run for re-election again as a member of the National Parliament if you'd historically held that position. So Ian Paisley could have stayed as the North Antrim MP and the MEP, but a new candidate who had not previously held those two mandates could not do that. So Nigel Dawes was debarred from standing. So it meant that the DUP had really, to put it in American terms, an open primary on who was going to stand for the party in 2004 for the European election. A number of people put their names forward. William McRae put his name forward, and also Maurice Morrow, now Lord Morrow, put his name forward. And I think at the time it sort of felt that those two were vying for it. Well, Peter Robinson had other ideas, and Peter took the decision that they needed to court Jim Allister and to bring Jim Allister in, and ultimately then Jim agreed that he was going to come into the party. I remember the day I was working in the policy unit of the DUP at the time. I remember the day when Peter Robinson came in and told us that Jim Allister had agreed to be the person who was going to stand for the party in the European election. And I remember Peter was over the moon. There was great joy in party headquarters. I remember thinking at the time, this could be a mistake. And I vocalized. I said,
Why
Peter,
do you think that? I mean, because this was the interesting. Jim Allister been gone for so. I remember when he was announced, and I remember going, "Who's he?" Because he'd been gone. Just to stress for listeners, Jim Allister left active politics in the 80s.
And I can't stress to you how successful Jim Allister was at the bar. Jim Allister was a very, very, very successful barrister. He was sought after in criminal cases. He's the guy. If you're up on a serious criminal charge, he's the man you wanted defending you. There was no doubt about that. Jim was ferocious at the bar. So to walk away from that very successful criminal career, criminal barrister career, I should say. Don't sue me, Jim. And to walk away from that very successful career at the bar, it was something. It was quite a shock within the legal profession. It was quite a coup within politics. And I thought at the time, no one is going to walk away from being such a successful barrister with a very successful career without ambition. And I voiced it at the time. Now my fear for Peter Robinson was that Jim Allister was probably the only person within the DUP who had the brains and the capability to challenge Peter for the leadership when MPSC walked away. So my concern, which I'd voiced at the time, was that to be wary of bringing Jim back in, because Jim might actually challenge Peter for the leadership of the party and could actually be popular enough to beat Peter. And I think, as we've seen, Jim is a political strategist who is at least the equal of Peter Robinson.
Yeah.
So I felt that was going to be different. I never in 10 million years envisaged that there'd be a new party formed and Jim Allister be North Antrim MP and all of that would happen. But I did think that it was very risky because a power base could be built around Jim. And that's what happened. And then the TUV was formed.
And funny enough, the TUV, Jim Allister gave Peter Robinson his first big headaches of the first 2 years of Peter's leadership. From
his headaches throughout his leadership. Jim Allister was the thorn in Peter Robinson's side at every twist and turn.
Michael, just on, because obviously Jim Allister left in 2007 over the DUP's decision to go into government with Sinn Féin. And I mean, by 2004, I mean, for me anyway, I always thought it was pretty inevitable that the DUP would end up in government with Sinn Féin at some whatever incarnation that took. What did you make actually watching that at the time? 2007, you're in the newly minted executive. Jim Allister's walked away. This new party has been created. And in 2009, at the European election, where Jim Allister stood as TUV this time and ran the DUP bloody close to actually taking that seat. It was really, really close. What did you make?
Well, you just mentioned there, Jim, not quite succeeding in defending the seat, the European Parliament seat. But I was there in the King's Hall for that count and that announcement. And Tim's mentioned Jim's ferociousness. And he made a ferocious speech that day. And he said something like, I mightn't have got in, but I got a big vote. And some of you out there better realise that's a lot of P45s for you guys. And I was nearly shuddering in my boots myself, even though I wasn't likely to be one of those MLAs to lose their seat.
And Michael, there was that debate. You can see some clips of it on YouTube, the European debate, where Diane Dodds, the DUP candidate, wife of Nigel Dodds, who Tim was just talking about, tries to take on Jim Allister over some milk quota issue, and Jim Allister just absolutely, it was a car crash. It was a car crash.
But that particular count, the big beast in the room was Jim Allister, even though he hadn't been elected. The other thing I'd say is I've always liked the TUV perversely, given that there's not a lot of policy overlap between where I would be and where they are. And Tim has maybe just very simply clarified it for me. The reason I like them is probably because they are such a thorn in the side of the DUP, and Jim Allister in particular, because he is not just ferocious, he can look after himself, he can out-debate people, you know that he won't back off on something, you know if he makes an argument he can stand it up, and he has been impressive. And the other thing that Jim Allister, almost on his own, has achieved in the Assembly, he's like a one-man watchdog on expenditure and waste. And when you hear Jim going on about the squander and waste, I can imagine these civil servants quaking in their boots around the different departments. So he has done all of that. The only thing I would say, and even though they got the seat in North Antrim, the TUV stronghold, and they got quite good votes. There are platforms around other constituencies. They were runners-up, I think, in East Antrim and in Strangford, where they came close to picking up assembly seats. But overall, I would have to say, even though I enjoy them, and I enjoy Tim Gaston as Jim's successor. But what I would have to say is Traditional Unionist Voice, they are running against the tide, really. As Northern Ireland changes, as it changes with demographics, as it changes with the through running of all the equality legislation, it's not the same place as it was. And if your offering is, let's get back to the way things were, the traditional unionist voice, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
So they're swimming against the tide. So if we're asking the question, where are they going? Yes, they might get the odd symbolic victory and bloody a DUP nose here or there. But overall, are they really going to capture unionism or capture government?
This is where I want to go back to Tim here, because Tim, obviously you were an active DUPer. For anyone who's maybe of a certain vintage, you may remember a very young Tim Kearns in 1998 running around campaigning against the Good Friday Agreement. The DUP occupied that role of being kind of the Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder of David Trimble, then the Ulster Unionist Party, were the largest party. But Peter Robinson in particular, Tim, had bigger ambitions for the DUP. He and I know a close group around him were very much of the view, no, we can supplant the Ulster Unionist Party. We can be the leaders of unionism. And do you see those dynamics within the TUV? Do you think the TUV have the hunger that you young DUP activists had around 98 to 03 to when you actually do supplant the Ulster Unionists in 2003?
I think it would be difficult for the TUV to supplant the DUP in the current political climate, but I do think the TUV are still an important voice in unionism. I mean, obviously John Tong's book, which catalogues what you're talking about, it's called From Protest to Power, and I think that's exactly where the DUP went, from this party of protest. And Peter Robinson then transformed them into the party of power, which then, of course, Jim Allister, seduced maybe by that power that Peter Robinson had brought in 2003, decided to come back in to the DUP and stand for the European election. But I do think that protest voice is important, because although Michael says, you can't go back, it's different days, they're still within unionism. And I mean, this is maybe one for a deeper dive into about, sort of Protestant psyche and where that leads into unionism. I think that there is that important element that the TUV represents, which is actually an extension of sort of Protestant thought, where their protest. I mean, Protestantism was born in protest, right? And so there is still very much that undercurrent of protest, of this, constantly saying this is not good enough, this has to change. A purity at the core, and that's certainly where Protestantism was born, in that idea that there's something more pure than this. And that voice, I think, will always be, as long as there is a unionist vote in Northern Ireland, there will always be that voice of protest, because there will always be that pursuit of there's absolute purity and absolute clarity that can be achieved. Yeah. And I think that's what they represent, and I think that's an important voice for unionism, and I think the TUV play that role well, and it's an important role. I think that unionism unionism needs if it's going to maximise the vote.
I always thought, I remembered when one of the DUP criticisms when Jim Allister won the North Antrim seat, apparently it was because a victory speech was given where I think, I may be misquoting it here, but I think it was because the criticism was the king was not thanked or the king was not recognised. I kid you not. And there was no mention because Ian Paisley used to sing, what is it, the doxology, Tim?
He did,
Whenever
yes.
he won, he used to sing this religious verse whenever in all his victory speeches in North Antrim. But the only other thing is that in terms of where they're going, Michael, I want to go to you on this, obviously, is that the TUV do have this kind of honest broker role, and Tim is right. There's a spectrum from the. I mean, Lucid Talk polls have them at 11%. They're rivaling the Ulster Unionist Party consistently, and in some polls they're actually narrowly ahead. But yet, we saw in the Assembly election, TUV got a big vote, but only elected one seat. Why? They don't get transfers, and we have a preferential voting system here. How did they break that? How did they become more transfer friendly? Because in essence, that takes them away from what Tim is saying. They have to become more kind of cuddly and lovable. They have to become a wee bit more like Alliance. You know, seriously, this Alliance and the SDLP to get those transfers to elect those those 3, 4, 5 other MLAs.
Well, it's very difficult for them in the world of transfers, and they're not going to get it by being cuddly and lovable. They're going to get it by people having respect for them. And if they carve out this niche that Jim Allister started, and Tim Gaston is continuing with, to be the value for money, let's see some proper order here around Stormont's finances and cut out all the waste and cut out all the squander, they might just get a kind of common sense transfer tick from other unionists. They have platforms to build on in several constituencies, but I still go back to the point that I don't think they belong to the future in the long run. For example, I went along to the anti-protocol rally in Lurgan, the one where they had the rope round Doug Beattie's poster, and they and while the politicians there, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson and Jim Allister, made perfectly reasonable speeches, the atmosphere was, as Tim's alluded to, almost like a biblical kind of revivalist big tent event. And there was one guy got up and he said something like, make no mistake, we're in the same position as we were in when we had to fight King James and his Roman Catholic army, and remember, the enemy's not changed one bit. This sort of stuff. Now, it went down well enough with the people at the rally, but it really has very little to do with modern politics in Northern Ireland.
We're going to get Tim. We're going to get Tim into his quarterly reminder that he voted Remain and didn't support leaving.
But I want to know? Did you enjoy it, Michael? Did you get stirred up by the rhetoric?
No, I felt a bit uncomfortable actually with that kind of naked. I think it was fair to say sectarianism, and also there's a few.
Can I just probe?
There's a few lads running around giving out leaflets about Michael, some massacre of Protestants.
Can I just probe, why on earth did a former SDLP special advisor, which of the most pro-European party in Northern Ireland, what on earth provoked you to go to an anti-protocol rally?
I wanted to see what the arguments were. Has this trade arrangement, which is undeniably somewhat undermining of the union, do they really care about the trade, or is this just another flag dispute? Or is it another Drumcree, or is it not? I wanted to know, so I went to get it from the horse's mouth at Brownlow House, Lurgan.
Okay, before we go on to have a chat with Timothy, so we'll be able to put some of this to him. But Tim, I just want to get a final thought from you on the next Assembly elections, obviously 2027, and this time, obviously, because Jim's now in the House of Commons, it's Timothy Gaston is the focus in the Assembly. How do you think he's done in actually flying the flag for the T? Because replacing Jim Allister is a very hard act for anyone. How do you think he's done?
Yeah, I mean, he's doing well, I think. I mean, I think, going back to Jim Allister's victory in North Antrim, I mean, a lot of people were surprised by that. I think a lot of people in the DUP were surprised by that. A lot of people in the DUP were pleased with his victory, I think it's fair to say, because a problem had gone in Ian Paisley. And I think if there's a lot of the UP people I spoke to who were giving a little grin and a little smile, and that Ian Paisley had gone. Nobody said anything too much, but certainly you could tell there was an undercurrent of happiness. And but then I think reflections went and the spotlight went on to the TUV. How's this going to go for them? Because obviously, as we've talked about already, Jim Allister is this amazing forensic mind, this undoubtedly fantastic barrister who destroyed people in the assembly with just a sentence. And could Timothy Gaston then replace that? And of course he couldn't. Like nobody could. There's no one unless you go and get another unionist KC and get them into the party. No one was going to replace that. But I think he's done okay. I mean, he certainly had big shoes to fill, and whilst he's not filled them, I think he's proved himself to be fearless, which Jim Allister was. I think he's proved himself to be quite effective in that disruptor role, if that's what you like. I mean, I know some people don't like it, but I mean, watch the the TEO committee, and goodness, I mean, the chair and some of the other members from other parties are given are been run rings around by him, and they're being given a headache. That's for sure, and he's making headlines, and that's good. So I actually think he's probably secured his seat in North Antrim. I think he's done well enough as filling that disruptor shoes to be able to say he's got a better than fighting chance to keep his seat. So, and I think then we'll see what happens. Can the TUV build on that?
Okay, well, we will have a chance coming up next to actually speak to Timothy Gaston. Successor Jim Allister, MLA for North Antrim, will be coming up next on the podcast, so do stick with us for that interview. Back to Stormont Sources on the podcast today. We are delighted to be joined by the MLA for North Antrim, the TUV's sole MLA, Timothy Gaston. Timothy, you're very welcome to Stormont Sources.
Thank you very much for having me.
Timothy, just first question, just to lead off. Obviously, we were chatting earlier in the pod about what a big personality Jim Allister has been in politics, and obviously Jim Allister's been in the Assembly since 2011. Replacing him as an MLA, that must have been a little bit daunting, surely, for you. How's that been, and how have you actually found being there? I mean, I know the TV are pretty anti our institutions, but is it as bad as you probably thought?
Well, to be honest with you, I always thought Jim was maybe a wee bit too hard on Stormont. But see, once you're in there and you see it from the back benches, you think, Jim wasn't half hard enough in this place. It certainly has opened my eyes to politics in Northern Ireland. But getting on to replacing Jim set a standard for any politician to live up to. Jim set a standard for anybody to aspire to, regardless of party or background. As far as a parliamentarian goes, Jim Allister's right up there with the best that we have experienced. And to be honest with you, Stormont Assembly is all the poor for not having Jim there, for his level of scrutiny, for his level of debate. He brought something different to the chamber, and it was daunting. Let's get it out of the way. It was daunting stepping into that role, having shoes to fill. Jim's feet is size 8, my feet size 9. So I was comfortable when I was coming in that I wasn't going to fill his shoes. And I've really taken an approach where I'm not Jim Allister. I'm not a KC. We do things differently. And hopefully I brought a different perspective to TUV. It's the same message, absolutely. Same principles. But at the same time, we just go about our work differently. I don't aspire to be Jim. I think if I do aspire to be Jim, I'll come up somewhat short. He's well polished, whereas I can be very rough around the edges, as you can see. But, any opportunity I get, I'll rise to my feet and I'll make the points. And that's what I've been sent there to do. I'm there to do a job. I'm not there to love the institutions. I'm not there to prop up the institutions. So I'm firmly with the mindset that I'm going in there to do a job for the party. And I trust in my short time there that people see that and have hopefully excelled in expectations. Because let's face it, people thought when Jim left Stormont, the TUV voice disappeared. I would become irrelevant sitting in the back row, where I think that proved some people wrong in that.
You certainly have proved people wrong. I mean, you've certainly been a ferocious voice from the backbenches. But I'm just wondering about your message coming up to the party conference this weekend. And obviously, I think a lot of the focus this weekend is going to be in and around the protocol. The Donaldson deal and the restored institutions. But as you're setting out your agenda this weekend, what's the TUV's plan here? How is the protocol going to be reformed? How is the Donaldson deal going to be rolled back? What's your vision for the future?
So, Tim, when you talk about the Donaldson deal, you're ultimately referring to safeguarding the union, you're referring to the protocol, you're referring to the Windsor framework, all that we were told was sorted. We have this amazing deal that's dealt with all the problems, which is clearly not the case. So what we have, and Jim has set out very clearly, and what we do regard to the protocol is mutual enforcement. And if you think back, actually, where this idea of mutual enforcement arose, it actually came from the EU itself. And to be honest with you, my impression is that the EU were keen on mutual enforcement until the Irish Republic got involved. And there's an element of, we want to use this to punish the UK for the people daring to want to step away, wanting to have Brexit, wanting to control their own destiny. And it's very much that mutual enforcement, I believe, is the way forward. And the longer this goes on, I think that argument will gather more pace. It's like,
Can you just set out what mutual enforcement is? So when you say mutual enforcement, what's the TUV mean by that?
So when we talk about mutual enforcement, so if you're producing goods for another country, you make them goods to their standards and vice versa. So people trading with us will make goods to our standards coming into the UK. So it's not rocket science, essentially. And if people then are in breach of that, well, then the government takes action on it. There's no need for all these ports. There's no need for all this convoluted paperwork. There's an element of it works the world over. So why not enforce it here? And like, this is the brainchild of the EU. This is what they wanted originally. So if we're selling goods into Europe, we make them to their standards. And if they're selling goods to us, they make them to our standards. And anybody that's in breach of that, there should be tough penalties. Let's not get away from that. There should be tough penalties for anybody that's in breach.
And you say it was the Republic of Ireland who were against that. So, what, in your view, what happened there? How did that break down? If this at the beginning was the way forward, and people were thinking this could be the way forward. So, what do you see as the reason that didn't happen?
Well, I think the number of stunts that republicanism essentially showed when we were setting out the case for Brexit and what it would look like. I can have a picture in my head of, was it Mary Lou and Michelle standing at a border post with sledgehammers knocking down a wall, and this threat of violence returning, which was never going to be the case. To me, that then gave them ammunition to take and set out a stall that, oh my goodness, if we don't look after Republicans here, nationalism, that there'd be trouble returning to Northern Ireland, there'd be trouble potentially returning to the UK, and there'd be civil unrest, there'd be this and that and the other. And the threat of that appears to have won. Whereas, if we look back, mutual enforcement has always been the solution, which doesn't disenfranchise people here in Northern Ireland. And sadly, that argument has been trumped by this threat of violence that may appear if there's such thing as a camera wanting the border, the land border where it should be. And if you look at a different aspect of it, they say the border doesn't exist, but when it comes to immigration, the Irish Republic would be very happy to step in and say, oh, there is a border, and if anybody comes across it shouldn't be, we're going to send them back to Northern Ireland. So they can't have it both ways. Mutual enforcement, to me, is the ideal situation and the best way forward. It should always have been the preferred option, but sadly the threats that have come about, essentially, and the perceived threats that has been lost somewhere in translation.
I don't disagree with that. And I think most unionists listening to this, I think you'd get broad agreement with that. I think, if you were to speak to, if we had any unionist on now, what you've set out in the last few minutes, I think there'd be broad agreement. But I think here's the difficulty is, how do you get there? And the reality is, whenever the DUP brought down the Assembly, but before the last Assembly election, before the deal was done, safeguarding the union deal was done. It seems to me that this wasn't obtainable. This wasn't going to be brought about, and having Stormont down and having Stormont not functioning actually is worse for the union than having Stormont functioning, because in any opinion poll, when unionists say they would rather have Stormont than have direct rule. So how are you going to bring this about without doing damage to the union? Because it seems to me that when Stormont is down, when Stormont has collapsed, not that I have a very high opinion of Stormont, let me be clear on that, but when it's down and when it's collapsed, it seems to me that the union is damaged. So how are you going to bring this about without damaging the union? Because it seems the institutions have to collapse. And I think we've got to make, as unionists, we've got to make this place work. And we make this place work when we make the institutions work. So what's the TUV's answer to that?
Well, the institutions don't work. Let's be very clear. My time in Stormont, it's reinforced that Stormont will never deliver. But if we go back to how we got to this place, why mutual enforcement wasn't obtainable, why it wasn't the outcome, I believe through weak leadership within unionism. We had the wrong people at the table. We had people that sold us a crock of lies. And I think when you were dealing with the British government, we talk about bringing strength to unionism. The DUP were trying to keep us at arm's length, keep us away, happy to stand on platforms when it suited them. But realistically, we should have had a place, we should have been feeding into that process as how we bring about mutual enforcement, how we bring about a deal that will solve the problems of the Irish seaboard and, realistically get rid of it. Weak leadership has led us to where we are. Now, we keep going on the path we're trodden. I do believe that over the next couple of years, the message will start to cut through more. And how we get to the place where we need to be is putting your trust in TUV. I believe that bringing that strength to unionism, bringing that strength to the argument, they'll see that through time the British government have to act. It's unworkable what we have. Like, we're still living in some of the grace periods. The partial quarter of things is still to come. And at some stage, the penny will drop. And this isn't just a unionist issue. This is about people of Northern Ireland. That when they're trying to get their parcels from mainland UK, businesses are starting to kick up more of a noise about it as well. Not available in Northern Ireland. But why is it not available in Northern Ireland? It's because of the protocol. The protocol will not work, and it will bring instability to Stormont. At some stage, you talk about the union is better with Stormont and the lights on. And I've heard this from a number of DUP MLAs. And their argument is it doesn't matter what happens in the building. As long as the light's on, apparently unionism's in a better place. Whereas I think the longer the lights are on in Stormont, the more damage it does to public confidence. And that's me being brutally honest from what I've seen in my time in Stormont.
Don't you think that the Stormont failing is actually what Sinn Féin want? Because Sinn Féin needs Stormont to fail in other words to strengthen the argument for a united Ireland. And I think if the institutions are collapsed and if we reform the institutions, I think there's two things. One, I think history tells us that any reform of the institutions is going to benefit republicanism, not unionism. And I think two, any further collapse in the institutions is going to be evidence that these institutions can't work, and therefore we need to try something else. Direct rules are not an option. Therefore, does that strengthen the argument for an All Ireland?
Well, let's turn this around a bit. So you're saying Sinn Féin want the institutions to fail because of the poor results in the south. Sinn Féin need the institutions to be workable. They need to be shown that they can deliver government. Like, I watched some of the Dáil the other day, and I'd never seen a bigger circus in all my life, where they're standing up and haranguing the speaker, disregarding the speaker. So if that's the sort of government that they could muster down south, like, that absolutely drives the coach and horses through any confidence that Sinn Féin will deliver. So I believe that it's in Sinn Féin's interests to keep Stormont up, to try and give this persona that they can deliver a government, to try and increase and improve their chances of forming a government at some stage down south. Like, let's look at it. So I picked up from the media Emma Little Pengelly when she was in Washington. Some of the tweets that were going out from the executive office, she had to get sign off from Michelle O'Neill or whoever, Conley House, before the tweets went out. My goodness, is that the position we've got ourselves to? That the DUP Deputy First Minister can't even put tweets out on a trip to Washington without Sinn Féin agreeing to it. You know, you're not selling the institutions to me here, Tim. And I think more and more as time goes on, like my first option would be to reform the institutions. Absolutely, 100%. A system that'll work, that'll mean that we haven't by right, or that Sinn Féin won't be gifted, a heart at the government of Northern Ireland, through mandatory coalition. If we can get rid of that system, I think then we can move on to better government and something that might deliver. But my goodness, we're programmed for
Right.
government.
I'm going to have to do I'm going to have to do a Paula Bradshaw here and cut in.
Michael, that could be controversial if people are watching.
But firstly, let me say, welcome to Stormont Sources, Timothy. It's great to have you on. And before I put a question to you, I must say, while I recognise the whole thing about filling Jim Allister's shoes, I think you've done really well. I think you have stuck with Jim's theme around waste and squandering and money being stupidly spent, and you're carving out a niche for yourself there. And while you may not have brought the ferocity of Jim Allister, you've brought your own style of humour, I think, and a degree of courage. So I think you've done very well. And as Tim acknowledged before you came on air, your seat, we think, is safe in North Antrim in the Assembly. Who knows, you might even bring in a running mate.
Before you came on air, Mayor Michael was telling us he was a closet TUV supporter, so you need to listen back to that.
I went to one of your anti-protocol rallies, Brownlow House, Lurgan. Great stuff.
Yeah.
But anyhow, no. What I was going to ask you, Timothy, was Traditional Unionist Voice suggests a unionism. And by the way, I found the exchange between yourself and Tim Kearns very interesting there about just where unionism is going or the separate visions. But as I look at it from a sort of nationalist perspective, I'm seeing a lot of change in Northern Ireland. Things are changing rather than going back to what was before. There's been a lot of demographic change. There's been the sweeping through of all this equality legislation and new processes and so on. And I'm thinking that going back is probably not a great selling point in the long run, that what is needed is some kind of more progressive unionism that's going to offer people who are in the middle, something to make them like the union better. And I'm just wondering, are you in the wrong place in the great sweep of history that TUV, even though you can bloody the nose here and there of the DUP and others, in the long sweep of history, are you just swimming against the tide?
Well, that's an interesting take on it. My faith, my conviction brought me to Stormont. And now that I'm in Stormont, I'll be dependent on that to get me through. Whether that appeals to everybody in unionism or appeals to a section of unionism, quite frankly, we'll see in the future. But I think I always refer to this sleeping giant amongst Christian conservative unionism that you don't really hear from that much, but are very good at going out at the polls and voting. And I do believe all this woke nonsense, all this single equality bill, all the things that are infiltrating what Northern Ireland has stood for years will motivate more and more people to come out and vote for a party where they know where they stand. And in TUV, you get a clear message of where you stand, and a party that you can trust. Unionism looking to the future. We've heard time and time again, 3 parties splitting the vote if you could all work together and all this great stuff. I believe unionism is too big and too broad a church to have one party. I do believe at times there's potential that there is a traditional style party, because I believe my views, especially in Northampton, resonate with a lot of people. You look at Upper Bann, you look at different places around the country.
Yeah, but
And I believe,
can you ever be more though than like a thorn in the side of the DUP? Do you think the TUV could become at some point the big party in unionism?
well, that's over to the electorate. But what I'm looking at is opposition, and strengthening our bid when it comes into the 2027 election. That we are classed as the official opposition. The opposition we have at the minute keep their gloves on because they don't want to topple the process. Whereas I'm coming in there, there's no holds barred. I don't care what the executive parties think of me. If there's a question needs asked, whether it topples the institution or makes them unstable, is irrelevant to me. I'm there to do a job. So yes, I'm very much focused on bringing that voice to TUV, bringing that voice of strength to unionism, which then will deliver in the future increased bums and seats in Stormont. And at some stage, like, I'm not going to make any bones about it. I would love for TUV to replace the DUP as the lead party of unionism.
Okay, and David,
That's
indulge me.
the ambition.
Okay, indulge me, David. Just one more question. I would agree with you, Timothy, that the DUP came up short with their deal, as Gavin Robinson said, oversold it is kind of a generous description of it. They made too much of it. But have you not at the same time made too much of the damage to the union that's being done by the protocol and the Stormont, the Windsor framework and so on? In the sense that, yes, it's tends to be undermining of the union on the points about law that we have very little say on, although when we were in Europe, Northern Ireland had very little say in these matters. But in terms of damage to the union, I mean, King Charles was here the other day and Sinn Féin were queuing up to meet him. And, as far as I can see, I'm every bit as much in the United Kingdom today as I was before the protocol came along, or the Windsor framework, or the Stormont break, or any of the rest of it. Are you not making too much of it?
If you go down to Larne, Michael, and you see the millions upon millions being spent on border posts separating us from the rest of our country, I think that would be a reality check to you that no, we're not. Like, what's happening at the minute? There's still grace periods in place. And once that the grace periods come to an end and we really see the protocol, Windsor framework, whatever you want to call it, bedding in, like, we will be detached. And you're talking about laws. What we're talking about is 300 areas of law which govern our economy. Like, that's massive. That's massive. We've already seen the divergence of trade. Instead of east-west going north-south, benefiting the Republic instead of, us being an integral part of the UK. And that's going to bed in more and more and more. If you go to try and get some stuff from GB, if you're a unionist nationalist, that's irrelevant. You can't get a lot of the products because they're not selling to Northern Ireland. I could get something as easy from right across the world now as I could from GB because of the barriers that's put in place. And there's a lot more stuff coming down the road. No, we're not. We're given an early warning of what's coming. And if we don't do something quickly, once you align Northern Ireland with the South economically, that's something the Provost tried to do 30, 40, 50 years of terror. Couldn't do it. But now we have border posts at each of our ports. My goodness, come on. Of course, we're not underselling the damage the protocol is doing to the union.
So, Timothy, just you've been saying about, you said something there, just to wrap up on this, you said something earlier about, opposition in Stormont, right? And you've outlined here, you've done a good job in the interview actually just talking about some of the issues that the TUV are standing on, and that maybe the official opposition doesn't have the gloves on. But if I look at loose top polls, you're tied with the Ulster Unionists pretty consistently. 11% was the last poll you were on. You should be on those numbers, tracking for at least official opposition status, which is 8 MLAs. But putting my election analyst hat on, you're not. And that's largely because you guys don't get transfers. So between now and 2027, what is your plan and the TUV's wider plan to become a much more broader based unionist party? Because that essentially means maybe moderating some language in some areas, Timothy. So is that something that's on the party's horizon? Is that something you're going to be focusing at all on for your party's conference over the weekend?
Like, what we're trying to do is really firm up our identity in politics, and that's on the message of bringing strength to unionism. I want to concentrate on what TUV is doing. Very much, you look at Westminster. Jim has fitted into Westminster. He should have been there years ago. Like, he can just go onto the green benches and lock horns with anybody there and not seem out of place. You know, he has brought a different standard to the MP role from Northern Ireland, and is gaining a lot of respect across the House because of that. So we're showing what we can do in Westminster. I'm trying to keep the banner flying in Stormont, and I think so far we're doing okay in that. So showing what we can do with one MLA in Stormont that isn't Jim Allister. So this whole thing, oh, he's only a one. I agree with Jim Allister, but he's only a one-man band. Whereas we have been trying through the media over the last year, 2 years, to really build the profile around, you know, the strength and depth that we have within our party, and that's something I think people really underestimate. Like, really, I think this is the same role I carved out in Mid and East Antrim. A lot of the things I've done in Stormont, I've taken from the council time, but because you're a councillor, you don't get the same profile. People don't know you the same. Whereas you throw you into the toy town of Stormont, and there's a lot more media comes with it, and you seem to get a far bigger profile. Like, if I was a councillor, I'm not entirely sure you guys would be knocking on the door wanting to speak to me about in your podcast. But like, so we have been able to progress. Jim has set a standard in Westminster. I've set a standard in Stormont, and we have credible councillors. Like, you look at Ron McDowell and his media performances. My goodness, it could go toe-to-toe with anybody, and with a number of councillors that could do that, given the chance and stepping it up. So what we need to do, and I think we've, you know, got away from this one-man band. I think we're turning into more like a string quartet with a number of people now starting to come through that people know who TUV are, but it's really setting out our stall from that. And that's where you have the DUP looking over their shoulder at us. There's been a number of things we have laid on in Stormont, like the McMonagle stuff, was really up pushing that. The Irish language stuff at Grand Central Station, the MLA pay increases, you know, you name it, them's big ticket items. That TUV, this one person has been able to bring to the fore. So when you have DUP, they're looking over their shoulder. The last election, I believe, what turned the tide and put Jim Allister into Westminster, yes, it was the protocol, but the bigger thing was trust. And I believe we have broken a boom now that we have been able to get an MP. It brings a different perspective. And all them people that say, oh, I would agree with everything that TUV says, but I can't vote for you because you're not going to win. Well, I think we have shown that getting rid of 52 or 54 years of Paisleyism in North Antrim, that we can win. The DUP have lost their identity. Do they swing to more hardline to TUV? Do they go next to Ulster Unionists? This whole one party catching all at some stage, you know, can't work. They have to try and get their own identity back of where they're headed. And the Ulster Unionists, I like some of their MLAs, absolutely, but what Ulster Unionists are going to turn up, nobody knows.
Well, I'm quite happy with the allusion to the string quartet. I hadn't thought of that. It's quite classic. Someone had said previously, rather uncharitably, Batman and Robin, but I wouldn't go. But in a sense, if somebody said that, it's almost a backhanded compliment in some ways.
I was just wondering on that, you know, on you as a one-man band, and I know we're almost out of time, but it does seem to me that a big problem in the Assembly is MLAs do not prepare for committees, MLAs do not prepare for debates, and you stand, I have to say, in massive contrast to that as someone who seems to be highly prepared. Not seems to be, you are highly prepared. You've gone in, you know, some of the committee videos that I've watched, you know, there's people asking questions that I don't know who's given them, or even saying I don't have any questions, whereas you're forensically questioning and probing what's going on. Just for people who are listening, just as a matter of just kind of maybe lifting the veil, like how do you prepare for that? You know, what's the preparation that you put in? How do you do that? Maybe this would be something that you don't want to comment on, to give the secrets to your colleagues who don't prepare. But how do you do that?
I think one of the main TV staffer, Sammy's face is about to go red here, so.
Okay, well, maybe if Sammy's going to come in and stop the podcast, don't. But I'd be really interested in how you prepare, because it really does. You and Jim before you really does stand in contrast to some of your colleagues.
Yeah, and the old saying, "Fail to prepare, prepare to fail," is very much true. I'm only as good as my team around me, and that's one thing in politics. It's not one person. You know, you have to have a team of people around you supporting you, and absolutely, that's something I'm very much blessed with, both in my office here in Ballymena and up at Stormont. And we're actually, there's some of us laughing the other night that we were sitting. I think it was 11:15. It must have been Monday night. We were sitting looking at stuff about the hydrogen debate, and I was sitting down at that stage after getting the Waynes to bed. Right, what are we saying tomorrow about this? And we were laughing about, is there any other agents in Stormont sitting doing the same thing at 11:15 Monday night, getting ready for Tuesday? And I'll be honest with you, that's not the case, and it's obvious that's not the case. You go into committee and people are asking questions of things that are in the pack that are there. Now, I do, when I get through, there's a lot of my questioning would be referring to page whatever. I'm trying to get more detail on what's there. But it's all about preparation. Absolutely, it's all about preparation. And listen, Stormont is a fast-changing beast. Essentially, you could go in and you could be fully prepared and think from the weekend what we're doing on Monday. And then this week, Grand Central Station was in the back of a question that I had asked. And then that just has set the whole scene for the rest of the week of what the news agenda is. But
I'm delighted to hear that.
I'm very clear that it's a team effort. And now that we have an MP and an MLA, we have been able to grow that team. We've been able to grow that support base. And like I take my hat off, and I try when I'm at party events to always give praise when praise is due. And like I can only do the job I'm doing because of the staff that I have behind me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I'm doing it very well. I'm delighted to hear you're studying hydrogen, because that is of the future.
Oh, you've touched on energy here. That's Michael's thing. Goodness.
Yeah, coming from Ballymena, it's something that over the years I've been very keen. And I don't know if you heard my contribution the other day. That what I said on Monday was more coming from the sceptical net zero stuff. But on the Tuesday it was promoting Ballymena and believing Ballymena should be a hydrogen hub. And I make no bones about that, because I, like yourself, I do see where the economy's going, and that's something that we need to be very aware of. And I will look out and unashamedly champion Northampton and Ballymena, and try and get as much leverage and jobs that comes into the constituency while I'm there.
We'll have to get you on to Holyrood Sources, our sister podcast, because they covered energy quite extensively yesterday on their podcast. But look, Timothy, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for coming on and for having a chat with us on Stormont Sources.
Yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, guys, that was an interesting interview with Timothy Gaston. Very laid back, but then that's quite par for the course with the TUV. They are actually one of the more open parties to kind of the media, if we can call it that.
Yeah.
He's pretty confident in their own skin, but I mean, Tim, you and him were going back and forth on the now so-called Donaldson deal, the deal that DUP used to restore the government. And I know you personally backed the DUP going back in. I know you had reservations, but did he say anything that made you feel like, you know, this is the right course?
I think that, you know, as I said in the interview there, I don't think you bring any unionists on this podcast who wouldn't say mutual enforcement is the way forward. I just don't see how we get there. It feels to me that, you know, if we bring the institutions down again, it does so much damage to the union. I think more damage is done to the union when we bring the institutions down, and I think that's a problem. And I think that, you know, as imperfect as they are, we need to make this place work. We need to, and I think for nationalists as well, I think it's in nationalism's interest to make this place work. I think it's in unionism's interest to make this place work. And whilst I don't think we should be rolling over on issues, I think it was right at the time that the deal was done to get back in and show that it's working. And, like last week we were talking about Emma on the podcast and how it's working and how she's moved to be the most popular politician in Northern Ireland. And I think, we can see that, a Stormont that works is a Stormont that benefits the union. And I think that, we need to, move to try and get those institutions reformed to make them work.
I agree with that overall analysis. And I thought the engagement between yourself, Tim, and Timothy was very good, but it didn't quite get to the conclusion. But had it got to the conclusion, really, I don't think TUV had anything else to offer other than we'd be tougher in negotiations than the DUP. And that's not really taking you anywhere, because I'm sure the DUP were as tough as they could be in arguing their case.
Well, it was essentially the Ken McGuinness Good Friday Agreement decision argument. Ken McGuinness said, on that fateful day when the Ulster Unionists decided to back the agreement, he always says, look, unionism always turns down a deal, comes back to the table, and the successor deal is worse. So, you really have a decision to make. Is the glass half full or half empty? And it really goes back to your securing the union point, Tim. Obviously, I know you disagreed with that decision at the time, but for the Ulster Unionists, David Trimble, his argument was, well, we have secured the union, we have got Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution removed. But the TUV argument, I do think, though, that, whenever I was asking him about the PR problem that they have, and by PR I don't mean public relations, I mean proportional representation, that transfer piece is just killing them. The TUV got nearly 8% of the first preference vote and only elected one MLA. That is unheard of. You think Alliance in 2003 on 3% of the vote elected 6 or 7 MLAs, and the TUV only elected one on nearly 8% of the vote. On 11% in the polls, it should be a slam dunk official opposition piece for them. But we're not talking about them as being the official opposition, because I think Timothy knows deep down that on 11% you'd normally be on for at least 10 assembly seats. But he knows at best they may only get 2 or 3.
But if you take even unionist areas, Strangford, where Stephen Cooper took, almost 13% of the vote and didn't get elected. When the first preferences were counted that day, I think people were pretty sure, okay, the TUV are getting a second MLA, and it didn't happen because the dial just didn't move for them. They barely gained, 400 or 500
and Alliance
transfers.
Just caught them,
And Alliance just caught them, overtook them, and got their second seat there. So, and I think that's a problem for them, because even in areas where unionism is the predominant voice, they're still not transfer friendly there as well. And I think that's something they need to address. And I don't know how they address that.
Michael, are they capable of? I'll end it off with you. Are they capable of showing maybe a softer image that the DP were able to do? Ian Pearce, I remember in his latter years of leadership, was pictured with his grandkids, for example, and showed a different aspect of his personality. Is that capable?
I think in what we've just seen, even, I think Timothy Dalton does, or Timothy Dalton, that's James Bond, I think. I think Timothy Gaston has
double union.
I think he has great potential to appeal to people, because while we all respected Jim Allister and were slightly fearful of him, Timothy Gaston brings humour and his own style, and that could catch on. Now, it's not going to catch on right across Northern Ireland, but it could catch on enough for them to pick up another seat or two. And we'd mentioned earlier about Jim Allister being somewhat humourless. I remember one moment we were walking down the corridor, myself and Margaret Ritchie, and she was limping with a sore back, and Jim remarked to her, is something wrong with you there, Margaret? She has a sore back, near the end of her leadership. And he said, it must be all the knives. And he had a sense of humour. But Tim, I think, has a personality that will grow on people. And
I think the big shock of this episode of the podcast is Michael's going to transfer to the TUV.
Well, that's right. You go to some odd rally. You're talking to a guy that goes to all the party conferences, but jeepers, protocol rally is new on me. Anyway,
you've got to go there if you want to really understand it.
Okay, well, do you know what? I'll take your word for that. I'll take your word for it. Anyway, that's all we have time for this episode of Stormont Sources. You have been listening to me, David McCann. You've also been listening to Tim Kearns and Michael McKernan. But just to let you know, if you want to get in touch with anything that you've heard, whether you want to agree with us or disagree with us, comment on what you're listening, please send us a WhatsApp on 0333 404 6507. That number again is 0333 404 6507. That's all we have time for this edition of Stormont Sources. Thank you for listening, and thank you for tuning in over the past few weeks. We'll be back next week.